The Forgotten Plague on PBS American Experience will air nationally in a little more than a week on February 10th here on Mountain Lake PBS and PBS stations across the country. There will also be a special preview screening next Tuesday, February 3rd. And we'll talk more about that coming up in just a few minutes. And joining us at the Roundtable this week to talk more about the documentary is Mary Hoteling, who is the founder of Historic Saranac Lake and its current historian. Welcome. Amy Kanze, who is the Historic Saranac Lake's executive director, and also our good friend Ed Kanze, who is an Adirondack naturalist, writer, and contributor here at Mountain Lake PBS. Welcome to you all. We appreciate you being here. So TB really has long shaped Saranac Lake's identity and history, dating way back to the early 19th century.
Yes, it certainly has. We're excited about this documentary that's going to help tell that story.
Did it begin in Saranac Lake with Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau's work, his pioneering work and study, or did it begin before that? Because we know in the early 1800s, there was a period where people who had TB went out in search of these pristine environments because they thought that the environment was good for them, and so they actually sought out these pristine environments.
Well, people were coming to the Adirondacks recreationally, and they began to feel as if it was good for their health. And of course, at the time, they couldn't really tell what might be wrong with their health. They couldn't differentiate between, say, lung cancer and tuberculosis. And asthma or allergies. There were all kinds of things that made you feel better when you went on vacation. And so they were coming to camp, and a few of them were doctors, and they were beginning to observe that these things were making an improvement. And so they were kind of trying to pull these things together, this thinking. And so there were people coming, but there was not much in the way of real publication or anything. I mean, that all happened after Trudeau. And he came because he thought he had been here hunting at Paul Smith's Hotel. Mm-hmm. He'd come hunting a couple of times as a young man. He was still a very young man. He was in his middle 20s. But he was married and a father, and he came because he thought he was going to die of his tuberculosis, and he decided that he wanted to go where he had been happiest, so he left home and came up here with a couple of friends to help him, and taking turns. He was very weak, and that sort of led to a synergy of there was a Dr. Loomis who suggested, well, yes, you're better up here than you were in New York. You might as well try staying the winter. And even though they thought, well, maybe he'll die, but at least he'll be happy. And so he tried, and then there began to be some publications about it in popular press, not so much in the medical press yet, but in the popular press.
Early on, they thought it was hereditary. And then by the time Trudeau was in the Adirondacks, did they then believe that it was caused by the bacteria?
Well, it took a while but what Trudeau brought to it was science. When he was trying with the sanitarium development, he was trying climatic treatment essentially when he first established that in 1884, and then he tried. Then he learned about a paper that had been written and given in Germany by Robert Koch about seeing the tubercle bacillus under the microscope. Mm-hmm. And when he saw this paper, he saw an abstract of it, and it was published 2 years earlier, but he didn't have the text. He didn't know what the real meat of it was. And a friend of his gave him a translation of Koch's paper, a handwritten translation just for him for a Christmas present in 1884. So he'd already started the sanatorium, and then he got this information about the science of it, and then he began to say, well, I've got to try this. And he went back to New York. He had gone to medical school, but they didn't even have a lab at the time. And he went back to learn how to use a microscope and and then he replicated Koch's experiments, which he did in 1884.
And as that work was going on, the sanatorium was open
it was already open.
And people were coming in waves to the Adirondacks?
Well, they were coming, but it was an evolutionary process, really, because they could only build there were little cottages for 2 people, and he only had, a room for 8 or so at the beginning, and it just grew. And so he was piling on one on the other.
Yeah. And as the years went on, many of those people survived. and the village, the region gained a reputation as being a place to come to be cured.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. But I mean, I wouldn't say there were many people that died. There were not. It's rather shocking how many people did die, but there was no other hope. You know, this was a real something you could offer to people where there was an opportunity to at least get better. But he had to divide. He had to say, well, this is for incipient patients. This is only people who have an opportunity to recover. If you're, it's not a hospital for the dying. It couldn't be. This is all not supported by any kind of government or grants or anything. This is all supported by basically his friends. And at the very beginning, it was touch and go financially, and he thought it wasn't going to make it. And people were just giving these cottages to him because they wanted to encourage him. They were his friends, and so it was chancy, but it built them.
Yeah. One of the things that people are really interested in about our story in Saranac Lake is that it really started with Trudeau, but over time the whole village got into the act of the tuberculosis industry. So I think often people come and visitors come and they expect to just learn about Trudeau in the sanatorium and our laboratory, which we now have as a museum, which was Trudeau's laboratory. But the story that really fascinates them is the story of how the community really got into the act of caring for patients. So there's several hundred cure cottages that have been identified all throughout the village that took in patients. And that's an interesting model. We don't know of another place like that in the country. Asheville, North Carolina, I guess for a little while tried, but they weren't as successful as Saranac Lake was. But Saranac Lake really was built by and for TB patients in one way or another, and it was a really prosperous community based around tuberculosis care all the way through to the early 50s. So. And
are many of those cottages gone now?
Some have been lost. Many have been changed over the years. It's hard to care for buildings in our climate and in a remote part of the Adirondacks. Unfortunately, a lot of the cure porches have been taken off, or the windows have been replaced, so they don't all look quite as glorious as they used to. But the historic Saranac Lake actually, back before my time, was founded as the first project was really to put about 170 of the buildings on the National Register in an effort to really draw attention to the preservation of the cure cottages in town and also the sanatorium and other properties. So we're trying to encourage preservation of the cure cottages, and there's a lot of people in the community that really understand that and are working to do that.
And to coincide with the documentary, Ed, you and producer Josh Clement from here at Mountain Lake PBS have produced a video where you look into the legacy of the cottages and the TB culture as a whole, that whole era in Saranac Lake.
Yeah, we have. We are actually working on the video as we speak, so it's not quite together yet, but it's an exciting project. And the station had the idea that the WGBH production is sort of a national focus, the big picture view on TB, that it would be fun to add a little bit of our local view. So we visited a few of the cure cottages and talked to some interesting people around town, and are producing just a short sort of local complement to the WGBH production.
Did a number of the patients who came during that era stay in Saranac Lake, or have their families remained in Saranac Lake? And so is there that legacy where you have either patients or relatives of patients still living in the area?
We definitely do have that. Many people did return home, but there are a number of families who stayed. It was sort of a feeling that you had to continue your cure in order to make it last. You had to keep on sleeping on your cure porch, and people did that.
Some people still do. There's a few people that still sleep out on their porches.
And of course, the legacy continues with the work at the Trudeau Institute. Dr. Andrea Cooper is part of the documentary, talking about the efforts still going on today to combat tuberculosis. We don't hear as much about it. Interestingly enough, we did just within the past couple of weeks, a case popped up across the lake in Vermont, one case at a school in Charlotte, and it makes headlines because I think a lot of people really don't hear much about it anymore and may assume that it's been eradicated. But really, in third world countries and much of the world today, this is still one of the deadliest killers known to humankind.
Sure. Well, it's really made a comeback with HIV in developing countries where people don't have the access to the medication that you need. I mean, even regular TB, the old strains that people were infected with in Saranac Lake, people have to take several drugs every day for up to 6 months to a year. So that's a lot of health care to need. So the drug-resistant strains are a real concern. We, at the museum, we get a lot of people that visit the lab that have a background in TB. We have health nurses, scientists, students in public health. So it's great. We learn a lot about TB, and we have a real sense of how real the story is today. I think it's something that we'll be hearing more and more about, unfortunately. There are now strains of tuberculosis out there that are completely drug resistant, and so people that get that disease, they're right back where the people were who were coming to Saranac Lake for the cure. They're really just relying on rest, fresh air, good food, but that strain of TB is much stronger than the strain that people had in the old days, so you really don't survive it. So it's a scary thing. It's a big, and what they're doing at Trudeau Institute is really important. I mean, that research is very important, and there's not a lot being done now because the funding is tough to get, so there's not many people doing the work that Andrea is doing.
And she's featured in the documentary. You are featured in the documentary as well, Mary, talking about the history, the legacy of that era.
Yeah, talking about Dr. Trudeau particularly, his personality and what kind of guy he was.
And you're writing a book,
I am.
A biography
of
Dr.
yeah.
Trudeau. He wrote an autobiography, but I don't think a lot of people knew that in his day he did write a book of his work and his life.
Well, and it was published in 1915, and for many years it was reprinted in cheap editions, and I think every patient probably had one. There are many, many copies that were out there, but it's sort of fallen out of use and fallen out of favor. Most people haven't read it. Even people who collect Adirondack books or read Adirondack books haven't read it, and so but it's full of charm to me anyway, and I'm trying to unpack it, I think, as they say.
So you're writing this on what will be the 100th anniversary of Dr. Trudeau's death.
Yes.
And so this fall you're releasing a new biography.
Yeah. And this one will be illustrated with a lot of photographs, because he had family photos that were at Trudeau Institute. They were given to the Saranac Lake Free Library, who's one of our partners in this publication. And
what an amazing collection.
Yeah, oh, it's a wonderful collection. I'm sorry I can't use all the photos that I would like to spec for the book, because but they're personal, a lot of them. And when they first published the book, it had a few pictures of buildings in it, but no people. And this is going to open it up a lot more in terms of the people that he knew. And there's so many people that he said were his dear friends. And one guides and other doctors and patients and just all kinds of people.
And do you get a new glimpse into his life, either his work, his scientific work, or his personal life, as you've done your research?
Yeah, I found a lot about it. About all of it.
Mary has spent years. We're thrilled that she has taken the time to really make this her, I think, 24-hour-a-day job at this point. It must feel that way, because you've spent 30 years, I think, researching and really compiling the story, and so it's going to be an amazing resource. And Caroline Welsh from the Adirondack Museum, she was the director there. She's been helping manage the project, and Adirondack Life is printing the book, which is really exciting. So, and we went about the public Trudeau Institute. Yeah. We went about the book a lot the way that Trudeau went about growing his sanatorium. He used to go house to house to his friends and raise subscriptions for. That's what he called it, right? For if he needed a building, he would raise a little bit of money, and so we raised subscriptions for the book, and I think we've sold about 150 pre-subscriptions for the book, and some grants that have come in. So it's pretty much paid for and ready to go once you finish up.
Are there new things we learn about Trudeau?
I'm learning a lot of new things about him, some of which I can put in the book.
Isn't that always the case?
Subscribe to see it, right?
There are a lot of wonderful stories. There's another wonderful source at Trudeau Institute because there's a woman named Marguerite Armstrong who was a patient there and then worked as a superintendent of the property for years and years, and then her husband worked as a property superintendent after her. So she spent her entire adult life on the sanatorium property, and she collected. And when she was at the end of her life, as Trudeau wrote his autobiography at the end of his life, she made these scrapbooks at the end of her life, kind of correcting the record in some cases. So she was telling things in more detail. She kept books. She kept the financial records a lot of times, and so she would be able to say exactly when cottages were built, cottages were moved around, who was the person who paid for it, and that sort of thing. So but I am having trouble keeping. There's so much more that I could put in this book, and I've got limited number of pages, and I can't put it all in. So I'm thinking I'd like to follow it up with a book about the sanatorium itself, sort of a document of just, these are the buildings, these are when they were built. This is kind of a fact-based thing. Instead, but anyway, Marguerite Armstrong had wonderful stories about the individuals who, particularly donors, who helped Trudeau with different cottages. There were probably 30 cottages up there at one time or another, given by families or individuals, and they were called by their names. And he was friends with most of the donors who did that. And he wrote apparently thousands of letters. I found a wonderful source because somebody who came in from the Osler Library in Montreal,
McGill,
came to the lab this summer and told, and so then we got this connection, and they said, well, we have some letters from Trudeau, so okay, can you send them to us? And yes, they did. And one of them alluded to an article that was in. It says, we want to print your work. Your work was wonderful, and we want to print it in the bulletin. Well, I wrote back to Osler and said, well, what bulletin? Can you give me what they wrote? Well, it was a wonderful thing. The Linux Society had a meeting in Baltimore, I think, a few months after Trudeau died, and it was essentially a memorial service of a number of doctors who were his friends, and 3 of them spoke about him. And the one that really got me was a young man named Henry Thomas, who was a doctor who had been more or less a patient and sort of a protege of Trudeau. He followed him around like his dog did. He said he went everywhere with him, to church and to hunt and so everything. And he was pages and pages of personal anecdotes about Trudeau as an individual. And he said when he wrote letters, he remembered seeing him sitting at a table in a room full of people laughing and talking, presumably in his house, and he's sitting there scribbling notes, and he'd throw them on the floor, write another one, throw it on the floor, and he said it would look like snow on the floor because he was a prolific correspondent. And I haven't read it. They're not all available, of course, but I haven't even read all of them because there's all that handwriting to do, It's so it's difficult to get it to get enough, but to think, that's such a personal view. Here's somebody in his house telling what it looked like, what it was like to be with him as a friend, and that is a whole nother view.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Speaking of letters, you had a relative that lived in one of the sanatoriums.
Right. Hers was just outside Saranac Lake and Lake Cushaqua, a place called Stonywald. And it was my aunt. She was there in the 1940s. She was one of the sort of the last people to go through the old-fashioned cure before antibiotics came along. And she had the work. She was in bed for months on end and upset, and she couldn't get out of bed and not even allowed to go downstairs and have Christmas dinner. She was a newlywed at the time. It was quite a trial for her to be there. She had a puncture put in her chest and air pumped in, and pneumothorax treatment, they called it. They collapsed a lung with air, and she said when they would come and check her pressure, it was like checking the tire pressure on a car, and that's how she felt. There's one point in the letters where you see that she was a very upbeat person. I knew my aunt well. She's been dead for many years now, but she had the sandbag treatment where they weighed your chest down with weights so you were just about suffocated. The idea was to limit chest movement as much as possible to rest the lungs. And that's the one point where you really see despair in the letter. She was just, it must have been incredibly depressing. She was a big, tall, strapping, energetic woman, about 6'1", and sort of a world conqueror type. And to picture her lying there in bed for months on end with, you know, sandbags on her chest is just hard to imagine.
And for many families, it really was a sad chapter in their history, because if they didn't survive, and many didn't, but if they did, a number of people weren't necessarily in the sanatoriums of their own free will. I mean, wasn't this an era when a number of people would be sent to the sanatoriums to get them away from other people so that they necessarily might not infect them?
I think if you really wanted to go, you could have gone, but I don't know if people really felt like they had that kind of say in that day and age. You know, the doctors were authority figures,
right.
And people's employers sent them for curing in Saranac Lake too. So I'm not sure people weren't exactly incarcerated in the sanatorium, but you know, you also knew that you really better listen to you know, you had to go along with the treatment, because it was your best chance of getting better. So
for some, there probably was a sense of isolation, though, and loneliness and desolation.
Well, years ago, I wrote a letter to the New York Times Book Review and asked, you know, there used to be a little place in the back where you could ask for people to send you information. And so I got one in there and I asked for information about curing in Saranac Lake, and I got this letter. I got a number of things back. They're in the files at Historic Saranac Lake, but one was a letter from a woman who said that her mother had had tuberculosis and her mother had never kissed her. And it was just tore my heart, you know, to think that you couldn't, that all these personal relationships were so interrupted by this. But I don't feel that people who came to Saranac Lake were sent there in a way that they couldn't leave if they wanted to. There were a lot of people who came and went on their own.
And I think the flip side of, you know, there was a lot of sadness and a lot of loneliness and death, but there was also a lot of happiness and romance that came out of the experience of a lot of young people being thrown together, and you know, wanting those who were well enough to get out of bed. They were pretty determined to appreciate their lives in a way that we probably take for granted. So there was a lot of kissing going on too, and a lot of the stories that we know are the ones that came from people who survived. So we tend to hear the happy stuff, and that's all fun. You know, there are a lot of neat stories there too.
Did it really end quickly in the 1940s with the antibiotic when it was discovered?
Well, it at least at Saranac Lake's part of the story did end quickly, because it ended in 1954 when they closed the Trudeau Sanatorium, which was sort of the precursor of everything else collapsing economically in the village. But they closed because they had warning of this for a couple of years, that, you know, the patient census was just going down, and that they would, because it was semi-charitable, it was people paid for part of their care, but they had to make up the deficit always with donations from people, and you know, that also was falling off, the donations and the number of people, and they just didn't think they could continue. So they closed the sanatorium in pretty short order in the fall of by Christmas of 1954. It was closed, and then with a month or two's notice.
And then the Trudeau Institute continued.
It wasn't that simple. It was, but Frank Trudeau, who was the grandson of E.L. Trudeau and was still practicing medicine in Saranac Lake, he was the head of the board at the time, and he had to close his grandfather's sanatorium. And what he decided to do, he took a couple of years off of new medical practice. He was a young man with a family, and he said, well, I've got to do this. So he closed the sanatorium, and he had to go back to all those many buildings that were there and were donated by individual families. Well, a lot of them had endowments, and he went back to each family and said, may I take the endowment and repurpose it, essentially, go back. And so so he was able to do that with almost all the buildings at the sanatorium. And then of course he wanted to sell the property, and that was a big difficulty, because he had to find somebody to take the property, and he finally found American Management Associations, who are still there. So they've been there almost as long as the sanatorium has been there. as it was before that. And he took the money, and he also had, since he was also a doctor, he had gone back to his teachers in New York and asked, okay, what should I do? How should we structure this? Because there was a laboratory, of course, as part of this. There was a sanatorium and a laboratory. And so he wanted to continue that, and he was able to do it, but it was touch and go, getting the money and then getting all the elements together, you know, selling the property, getting new property, which was given to him on Lower Saranac Lake by Edmund Guggenheim. And so there was a lot of to pull together to make this work. Yeah, there's a wonderful photograph of Frank Trudeau, unlocking the door ceremonially, and he's got this look on his face like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad it's over.
Took a lot of work.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Institute has continued on and done great work. As time has gone on, and it's more than a half century now since the sanatorium closed, is there a new wave of appreciation? Is there a wave of heritage tourism? Are you seeing people coming to the Adirondacks and to Saranac Lake to learn about the history of TB and the cottages that maybe you wouldn't have seen 10 or 20 years ago?
I think so. I mean, we weren't here as a museum 10 or 20 years ago. We opened as a museum about 5 years ago. And every year that we've been open, we've seen more and more people, almost doubling each year. So I think heritage tourism is something that is really growing nationally. It's something you hear more about. I think people in this era of all being plugged in and all being sort of living in our lives of, I don't know, you know, big box stores, and people when they get away, they want to go to an authentic place. They want to go to a place with a real story. So there's an interest in people want to go to a place that's maybe a little off the beaten path, that has something neat to experience and to discover. And Saranac Lake has that. I mean, I think every place has that. Lake Placid has the Olympic Museum and a great historical society. But we've seen a lot of people come back that are interested in the story. A lot of people have a personal connection still within their families. I mean, 1 in 7 people died of TB at the turn of the century. So if any of us dig back, we're going to find somebody with TB. And there's a real interest now in genealogy, so we get a lot of people with that interest. Now in Saranac Lake, we have the Hotel Saranac coming back, which is very exciting as far as positioning our community as a heritage tourism community.
So it's not just part of your history. It could be an important part of the village's future as far as tourism.
Absolutely. And I think we understand that, you know, Main Street is a real asset, our historic Main Street. So there's a lot of people working in today in Saranac Lake to help revitalize Main Street and help, you know, see what's happening at the Hotel Saranac happen up and down Main Street. And we're happy to be neighbors of the Hotel Saranac, so we're just thrilled. We're working hard to be ready for that because having, you know, a hotel in town that's open all season that, you know, is a beautifully restored 1920s historic hotel, that's just the kind of people that want to come see us. So we're busy getting ready.
Right. And Ed, when you and Josh went out and produced the video, was it easy to find many of the cottages, and was it easy to track down these pieces of history? I mean, obviously, we know where the sanatorium was. We know where the Trudeau Institute is now. But as far as the cottages, did you actually have to do quite a bit of legwork and homework to track them down?
It was pretty easy because, well, we had the help of people like Amy and Mary, and you can't walk the streets of Saranac Lake without seeing cure cottages everywhere you go. So the presence is very palpable there still. It's sort of the focus of our video, actually, is looking sort of at the present legacy. And just in response to that last question you asked about people coming here, one of the really interesting people we interviewed for the video, she's going to be in it a fair bit, very entertaining person, is Karen Lewis. And she was a television writer and playwright from New York City. She was friends with the people that founded the Pendragon Theater in Saranac Lake, came to visit, fell in love with the area. And what she fell in love with is partly this whole story about tuberculosis and curing. So she owns a beautiful former cure cottage, and she's restored and maintains one of the rooms as it would have been when somebody was there curing. And she collects antiques. It's full of the accoutrements that a tuberculosis patient would have seen there. So it was a real treat to get in there and poke around and also to talk to her and see her passion for this story.
That's fascinating. Do a number of people who now own the cottages much the same? Do they preserve part of the homes that were part of this legacy, or is that not really
that's
possible?
Kind of special to Karen. The other people that live in them, I think they're using them. Yeah.
But there's a sense of pride, I imagine, in living in a home that was such an important part of the village's history, and American history for that matter. So the documentary, The Forgotten Plague, will air on February 10th, but it's going to be screened a week earlier in Saranac Lake, and that's coming up this next Tuesday on February 3rd, 7:30 at Will Rogers. And everyone's invited. It's open to the public, and a chance to really celebrate Saranac Lake's place in this history.
It's going to be fun.
That's exciting.
Looking forward to
Hoping
it.
to see a big turnout. We're bringing all the chairs that we can scrounge up, so we're expecting lots of people.
And also, Ed, your video will be
Yes,
shown as
it'll
well.
be
Now, this is
debuted
part
at
of the
19.
Curiously Adirondack video series that you and Josh produced for Mountain Lake PBS. You received a PBS grant to produce these videos. They go nicely with your All Things Natural podcast on mountainlake.org on our website that
you.
people can listen to. And so that's an added bonus for folks coming Tuesday night. They can see that video and then enjoy the screening of the documentary. Everyone else nationally will get to see it on February 10th on Mountain Lake PBS and PBS stations across the country. Thank you all for coming in and talking with us. We
Thanks for having
appreciate
us,
you
Tom.
being here.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.